So, scary PSAs are an interesting thing. I absolutely bet that you read that extremely vague title of this video and you're thinking, what is he doing about scary PSAs? I know you're thinking it, but what I'm actually doing is talking about what I think makes a PSA scary. We will obviously look at some good examples that effectively are scary PSAs, but we're also going to look at some bad examples that try to do what the scary PSAs do, but fail on every regard. Also, quickly before we get into what makes a PSA scary, my merch store's back up at zakarmerch.com because I know quite a few of you are asking where you get this cool design, this little pusher man. Yeah, it's up on my merch store. Links in the description. Obviously, it's up here at the moment, zakarmerch.com. You can get that design on like shirts and stickers and stuff, as well as this Snake Man design and the Is There Anybody Out There design. So make sure to go check it out at zakarmerch.com. So, to figure out what makes a PSA scary, in my opinion, let's have a look at some good examples of PSAs that are scary. First, let's start with one of my favorite PSAs of all time, Yes Mum. I know this isn't a super scary PSA, but I think it's worth talking about. In the PSA, there isn't much going on visually as the whole PSA takes place in the bloke's car, but where this PSA shines is with everything else. The PSA is extremely effective with how it conveys its message. It's quite realistic for a situation like this. It's very memorable, the idea is absolutely great, and the subject matter is something that isn't talked about too much. So let's go through each positive of the PSA and explain why I think it's a positive. First off, you have the effectiveness. The PSA conveys its message well by showing shots before this incident has happened, with the passengers peer pressuring him into driving quicker to get to the party sooner, whilst they've all been drinking. We also see that he's a young and inexperienced driver because the biggest thing that tells us this is the P plates on his window showing that he hasn't even had his license for a year. The whole thing that ties this together is the main thing going on in the PSA is a result of his driving and being peer pressured into driving faster. So yeah, this PSA is effective, but the PSA is also quite realistic considering the situation they end up in. It's quite realistic because they could end up in a pond or a lake because of speeding, especially since it looks like they're driving around the country where there'll likely be no guide rails on the roads. Also, it's realistic that a driver could be peer pressured into driving faster, especially when they're all excited to go to a party and obviously end up getting drunk. So now, how memorable is this PSA? Well, obviously speaking on my own behalf, I think this is one of the most memorable PSAs in regards to it being a good PSA. Bad PSAs can also be memorable for being bad PSAs because they are so bad, but this PSA is absolutely the opposite. Lastly is the idea, and I really do think it's fantastic because things like peer pressure behind the wheel aren't talked about much in PSAs at all. I think that this PSA does it beautifully whilst also being a bit vague about it, but the thing is, if you pay attention to the PSA, you'll understand it. But now let's talk about the PSA that's visually scary, Tentacle. Yes, I know, I've talked about this PSA thousands of times now, but this is different to other times. First with this PSA, it's really effective at conveying its message being this that I can't read out loud. It's effective because of the whole PSA using a tentacle, which is weirdly kinda phallic as a metaphor for the whole message of the PSA and the emotional weight on the main character at all times. You understand what the PSA is about straight away when you see this thing, and I can't speak for the realism for how it actually feels, but watching the PSA, it does feel like a realistic metaphor for what this PSA is talking about. Also, do I really need to talk about the memorability? The PSA is memorable because it's so disturbing, and that ties into the visuals because the tentacle is really scary. Especially with the implications of what the tentacle actually represents, it makes the tentacle even more scary. So yet again, the idea is really smart because it's a really well done metaphor, and this PSA has some very serious subject matter, and the PSA doesn't shy away from it at all. So now we understand how PSAs can be scary. Now let's look at an example that tries to be a scary PSA but ends up falling flat on its face. Of course, we're talking about the PSA, Shame on You. Well, first off, how effective is this PSA? Well, I think you all know, this PSA is not effective at all. From the sad cover of Sweet Child O' Mine, to kids playing innocently in a forest, to a car flipping and ending them all, it's the opposite of effective. Also, the cover song really takes you out of the PSA. So the kids are playing in the forest, and that's fine and all, but when the car comes around after the bloke was speeding, it looks so fake and ridiculous that it's hilarious. You have to love the details, like the kids disappearing whilst their jackets stay, and the teachers not looking shocked at all about them being flattened. Just adds to the funny nature of this PSA. No wonder why this has become a meme, and a good one at that. So it really tries to force the message down your throat, and I think we just touched a bit on the realism as this PSA looks fake as shit. I will give the PSA this. It's memorable, but for all the wrong reasons. That's why this PSA is memorable. The positive things I will give this PSA is the idea and the subject matter aren't terrible. Speeding is a topic that should be talked about, and having a full classroom getting ended from a car is an alright way to show how many people died in car accidents since the year 2000. It is just executed terribly, and that's the huge problem with this PSA. It isn't subtle at all, because they establish the classroom for 2/3 of the PSA, and then randomly the car comes in and pushes the message of the PSA in your face. I feel bad for people that live in Ireland, because this PSA sucks, and having to be forced to watch this would be even worse. Well, we've had a look at a few examples of PSAs that are successfully scary in their own way, or fall absolutely flat on their face. I think throughout the video you may have gathered what I think makes a PSA scary, and they are the following things. Effectiveness. How effective is the PSA at conveying its message? Realism. How realistic does it depict the events in the PSA? Memorability. How memorable is the PSA? Visuals. How visually interesting is the PSA, and how scary is it visually? The idea. How interesting of an idea, and if it has potential to be very disturbing. Lastly is the subject matter. What subject matter are they tackling? And this last one is a smaller point that could possibly affect how scary the PSA is. Obviously, everyone does have their own opinions on what makes a PSA scary, so make sure to let me know your opinions down below in the comments. Anyways, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like. Make sure to subscribe as well. It does help me out a lot, because like 5% of you are subscribed, something like that. Also, I would love to get to 10k subs. That would be fucking awesome. Anyways, let's just go straight into the shoutouts. Massive thanks to the following supporters. Massive thanks to Ash Crimson, Miranda S, Diamond Pony, and Madeline Stringer for supporting my $2 pirate tier. Massive thanks to Elliot, Angie Patterson, and Juliet Wakefield for supporting my $5 pusher tier. Massive thanks to Sam M 1994 for supporting my $10 Pee Wee Herman tier. Lastly, a massive shout out to Fatima and Kadora for supporting my Top Chef tier. If you want to find out how you can get your names in my videos, please make sure to click the little join button on YouTube, or otherwise click the little Patreon logo on screen at the moment. Anyways, I'll see you all in the next video.